The Everlasting Man by G K Chesterton. Chapter 4, Part 2. At the beginning of this book, I ventured on a general summary of it, in a parallel between the rise of humanity out of nature and the rise of Christianity out of history. I pointed out that in both cases what had gone before might imply something coming after, but did not in the least imply what did come after. If a detached mind had seen certain apes, it might have deduced more anthropoids. It would not have deduced man, or anything within 1,000 miles of what man has done. In short, it might have seen Pithecanthropus, or the missing link, looming in the future, if possible, almost as dimly and doubtfully as we see him looming in the past. But if it foresaw him appearing, it would also foresee him disappearing, and leaving a few faint traces, just as he has left a few faint traces, if they are traces. To foresee that missing link would not be to foresee man, or anything like man. Now, this earlier explanation must be kept in mind, because it is an exact parallel to the true view of the Church, and the suggestion of it having evolved naturally out of the empire in decay. The truth is that in one sense a man might well have predicted that the imperial decadence would produce something like Christianity. That is, something a little like, and gigantically different. A man might very well have said, for instance, pleasure has been pursued so extravagantly that there will be a reaction into pessimism. Perhaps it will take the form of asceticism. Men will mutilate themselves instead of merely hanging themselves. Or a man might very reasonably have said, if we weary of our Greek and Latin gods, we shall be hankering after some Eastern mystery or other. There will be a fashion in Persians or Hindus. Or a man of the world might well have been shrewd enough to say, powerful people are picking up these fads. Some day the court will adopt one of them, and it may become official. Or yet another and gloomier prophet might be pardoned for saying, the world is going downhill. Dark and barbarous superstitions will return. It does not matter much which. They will all be formless and fugitive, like dreams of the night. Now, it is the intense interest of the case that all these prophecies were really fulfilled. But it was not the Church that fulfilled them. It was the Church that escaped from them, confounded them, and rose above them in triumph. In so far as it was probable that the mere nature of hedonism would produce a mere reaction of asceticism, it did produce a mere reaction of asceticism. It was the movement called Manichaean, and the Church was its mortal enemy. In so far as it would have naturally appeared at that point of history, it did appear. It did also disappear, which was equally natural. The mere pessimistic reaction did come with the Manichees, and did go with the Manichees. But the Church did not come with them, or go with them, and she had much more to do with them going than with them coming. Or again, in so far as it was probable that even the growth of skepticism would bring in a fashion of Eastern religion, it did bring it in. Mithras came from afar, beyond Palestine, out of the heart of Persia, bringing strange mysteries of the blood of bulls. Certainly there was everything to show that some such fashion would have come in any case, but there is certainly nothing in the world to show that it would not have passed away in any case. Certainly an Oriental fad was something eminently fitted to the 4th or 5th century, but that hardly explains it having remained to the 20th century, and still going strong. In short, insofar as things of the kind might have been expected then. Things like Mithraism were experienced then. But it scarcely explains our more recent experiences. And if we were still Mithraists, merely because Mithraic headdresses and other Persian apparatuses might be expected to be all the rage in the days of Domitian, it would almost seem by this time that we must be a little dowdy. It is the same, as will be suggested in a moment, with the idea of official favoritism. Insofar as such favoritism shown towards a fad was something that might have been looked for during the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, it was something that did exist in that empire, and did decline and fall with it. It throws no sort of light on the thing that resolutely refused to decline and fall, that grew steadily while the other was declining and falling, and which even at this moment is going forward with fearless energy, when another eon has completed its cycle, and another civilization seems almost ready to fall or to decline. Now, the curious fact is this, that the very heresies which the early Church is blamed for crushing testify to the unfairness for which she is blamed. Insofar as something deserved the blame, it was precisely the things that she is blamed for blaming. Insofar as something was merely a superstition, she herself condemned that superstition. Insofar as something was a mere reaction into barbarism, she herself resisted it because it was a reaction into barbarism. Insofar as something was a fad of the fading empire that died and deserved to die, it was the Church alone that killed it. The Church is reproached for being exactly what the heresy was repressed for being. The explanations of the evolutionary historians and higher critics do really explain why Arianism and Gnosticism and Nestorianism were born, and also why they died. They do not explain why the Church was born, or why she has refused to die. Above all, they do not explain why she should have made war on the very evils she is supposed to share. Let us take a few practical examples of the principle. The principle that if there was anything that was really a superstition of the dying empire, it did really die with the dying empire, and certainly was not the same as the very thing that destroyed it. For this purpose we will take in order 2 or 3 of the most ordinary explanations of Christian origins among the modern critics of Christianity. Nothing is more common, for instance, than to find such a modern critic writing something like this. Christianity was above all a movement of ascetics, a rush into the desert, a refuge in the cloister, a renunciation of all life and happiness. And this was a part of a gloomy and inhuman reaction against nature itself, a hatred of the body, a horror of the material universe, a sort of universal suicide of the senses and even of the self. It came from an Eastern fanaticism like that of the fakirs, and was ultimately founded on an Eastern pessimism which seems to feel existence itself as an evil. Now, the extraordinary thing about this is that it is all quite true. It is true in every detail, except that it happens to be attributed entirely to the wrong person. It is not true of the Church, but it is true of the heretics condemned by the Church. It is as if one were to write a most detailed analysis of the mistakes and misgovernment of the ministers of George III, merely with the small inaccuracy that the whole story was told about George Washington. Or as if somebody made a list of the crimes of the Bolshevists with no variation except that they were all attributed to the Tsar. The early church was indeed very ascetic in connection with a totally different philosophy. But the philosophy of a war on life and nature, as such, really did exist in the world, if the critics only knew where to look for it. What really happened was this. When the faith first emerged into the world, the very first thing that happened to it was that it was caught in a sort of swarm of mystical and metaphysical sects, mostly out of the East, like one lonely golden bee caught in a swarm of wasps. To the ordinary onlooker there did not seem to be much difference or anything beyond a general buzz. Indeed, in a sense, there was not much difference so far as stinging and being stung were concerned. The difference was that only one golden dot in all that whirring gold dust had the power of going forth to make hives for all humanity, to give the world honey and wax, or, as was so finely said in a context too easily forgotten, the two noblest things, which are sweetness and light. The wasps all died that winter, and half the difficulty is that hardly anyone knows anything about them, and most people do not know that they ever existed, so that the whole story of that first phase of our religion is lost. Or, to vary the metaphor, when this movement or some other movement pierced the dike between the East and West and brought more mystical ideas into Europe, it brought with it a whole flood of other mystical ideas besides its own, most of them ascetical, and nearly all of them pessimistic. They very nearly flooded and overwhelmed the purely Christian element. They came mostly from that region that was a sort of dim borderland between the Eastern philosophies and the Eastern mythologies, and which shared with the wilder philosophers that curious crave for making fantastic patterns of the cosmos in the shape of maps and genealogical trees. Those that are supposed to derive from the mysterious manes are called Manichaean. Kindred cults are more generally known as Gnostic. They are mostly of a labyrinthine complexity, but the point to insist on is the pessimism. The fact that nearly all, in one form or another, regarded the creation of the world as the work of an evil spirit. Some of them had that Asiatic atmosphere that surrounds Buddhism, the suggestion that life is a corruption of the purity of being. Some of them suggested a purely spiritual order which had been betrayed by the coarse and clumsy trick of making such toys as the sun and moon and stars. Anyhow, all this dark tide out of the metaphysical sea in the midst of Asia poured through the dikes simultaneously with the creed of Christ. But it is the whole point of the story that the two were not the same, that they flowed like oil and water. That creed remained in the shape of a miracle, a river still flowing through the sea. And the proof of the miracle was practical once more. It was merely that while all that sea was salt and bitter with the savor of death, of this one stream in the midst of it, a man could drink. Now, that purity was preserved by dogmatic definitions and exclusions. It could not possibly have been preserved by anything else. If the Church had not renounced the Manichaeans, it might have become merely Manichaean. If it had not renounced the Gnostics, it might have become Gnostic. But by the very fact that it did renounce them, it proved that it was not either Gnostic or Manichaean. At any rate, it proved that something was not either Gnostic or Manichaean. And what could it be that condemned them, if it was not the original good news of the runners from Bethlehem and the trumpet of the resurrection? The early Church was ascetic, but she proved that she was not pessimistic simply by condemning the pessimists. The creed declared that man was sinful, but it did not declare that life was evil, and it proved it by damning those who did. The condemnation of the early heretics is itself condemned as something crabbed and narrow. But it was in truth the very proof that the Church meant to be brotherly and broad. It proved that the primitive Catholics were specially eager to explain that they did not think man utterly vile, that they did not think life incurably miserable, that they did not think marriage a sin or procreation a tragedy. They were ascetic because asceticism was the only possible purge of the sins of the world. But in the very thunder of their anathemas, they affirmed forever that their asceticism was not to be anti-human or anti-natural, that they did wish to purge the world and not destroy it. And nothing else except those anathemas could possibly have made it clear, amid a confusion which still confuses them with their mortal enemies. Nothing else but dogma could have resisted the riot of imaginative invention with which the pessimists were waging their war against nature, with their eons and their demiurge, their strange logos and their sinister Sophia. If the Church had not insisted on theology, it would have melted into a mad mythology of the mystics, yet further removed from reason or even from rationalism, and above all, yet further removed from life and from the love of life. Remember that it would have been an inverted mythology, one contradicting everything natural in paganism, a mythology in which Pluto would be above Jupiter and Hades hang higher than Olympus, in which Brahma and all that has the breath of life would be subject to Shiva, shining with the eye of death. That the early Church was itself full of an ecstatic enthusiasm for renunciation and virginity makes this distinction much more striking and not less so. It makes all the more important the place where the dogma drew the line. A man might crawl about on all fours like a beast because he was an ascetic. He might stand night and day on the top of a pillar and be adored for being an ascetic. But he could not say that the world was a mistake or the marriage state a sin without being a heretic. What was it that thus deliberately disengaged itself from Eastern asceticism by sharp definition and fierce refusal, if it was not something with an individuality of its own, and one that was quite different? If the Catholics are to be confused with the Gnostics, we can only say it was not their fault if they are. And it is rather hard that the Catholics should be blamed by the same critics for persecuting the heretics and also for sympathizing with the heresy. The Church was not a Manichaean movement, if only because it was not a movement at all. It was not even merely an ascetical movement, because it was not a movement at all. It would be nearer the truth to call it the tamer of asceticism than the mere leader or loosener of it. It was a thing having its own theory of asceticism, its own type of asceticism, but most conspicuous at the moment as the moderator of other theories and types. This is the only sense that can be made, for instance, of the story of St. Augustine. As long as he was a mere man of the world, a mere man drifting with his time, he actually was a Manichaean. It really was quite modern and fashionable to be a Manichaean. But when he became a Catholic, the people he instantly turned on and rent in pieces were the Manichaeans. The Catholic way of putting it is that he left off being a pessimist to become an ascetic. But as the pessimists interpreted asceticism, it ought to be said that he left off being an ascetic to become a saint. The war upon life, the denial of nature, were exactly the things he had already found in the heathen world outside the Church, and had to renounce when he entered the Church. The very fact that St. Augustine remains a somewhat sterner or sadder figure than St. Francis or St. Teresa only accentuates the dilemma. Face to face with the gravest or even grimmest of Catholics, we can still ask, why did Catholicism make war on Manichees if Catholicism were Manichaean? End of Part 2 of Chapter 4.